I want to thank the chairman. I want to thank all the witnesses for being here. I also want to take this opportunity. It's probably going to be the last time that General Dempsey testifies before the committee. I want to thank you for your dedicated service and for the service of your family. And I know, General, that when you appeared before the committee on July 7th, I was actually the person who asked you about, there had been floated some views in the press at that time that Iran was pushing for lifting of the resolution on ballistic missiles and the resolution of arms, which we now know are in the agreement at 5 years and 8 years. Just to be clear, when you came before the committee then, you said under no circumstances should we relieve pressure on Iran on those issues. So was it your military recommendation that we not agree to lifting of those sanctions?
Yes, and I used the phrase as long as possible, and then that was the point at which the negotiation continued. But yes, that was my military advice.
Thank you. I also wanted to ask you about an issue I know Senator Ernst had talked about, and the Iranian cyber activity. And a number of years ago, we saw that there was an interruption of Iran's nuclear program through some other cyber activity, I think was reported, called Stuxnet. And that was reported in the press, I believe. In this agreement, according to paragraph 10.2 of Annex 3 of the deal, the United States is actually obligated under this agreement to help strengthen Iran's ability to protect against sabotage of its nuclear program. It might be hard for Americans to believe that we would agree to help Iran protect against sabotage of its nuclear program in light of its prior intentions. And General Dempsey, I wanted to ask your opinion on that. Do you think it's a good idea for the United States to help Iran actually protect its nuclear program against sabotage?
I hadn't thought about that, Senator, and I would like to have the opportunity to do so. I will say there is, back to the cyber question that was asked earlier, I think next week this committee and the Senate will consider some cyber legislation that we've been eager to see passed for some time so we can get ourselves better protected.
Well, when we know that Iran continues malign activity on the cyber front, the idea that we would agree to help them protect its nuclear program against sabotage, and I assume, as I read this language, that that would also obligate us to inform the Israelis, inform Iran if the Israelis were undertaking any kind of activities that might undermine its nuclear program, at least if we're going to adhere to the plain language of this agreement. So I wanted to also ask about this idea. We've heard a lot about sanctions. And sanctions, as I understand, Iran has written the United Nations on July 20th about this sanctions regime. And one of the issues that has concerned me about this agreement is that once the sanctions, the long list of mainly congressionally mandated sanctions that will be lifted under this agreement are undertaken, if Iran, for example, engages in terrorist activity, which it is known to do, separate from the nuclear program, Iran seems to have taken the position in its letter to the UN, and I've actually read the agreement, and I've been concerned that the agreement provides the same, that in fact Iran says it is understood that reintroduction or reimposition, including through extension of the sanctions and restrictive measures, will constitute significant non-performance which would relieve Iran from its commitments in part or in whole. So my question is, as I read this, I'm deeply concerned that if we want to reimpose the toughest sanctions on issues related to their terrorist activities and support for terrorism, which is another tool in the toolbox, General, aside from our military options, that Iran can then walk away from this agreement. And if the answer is you disagree with this characterization, please tell me where in the plain language of this agreement am I wrong?
Senator, the language says we can't reimpose the nuclear sanctions if Iran complies with the nuclear agreement. We have never given away any of our ability to use other sanctions regimes, terrorism or human rights.
But Secretary Lew, with all due respect, the nuclear sanctions are the toughest sanctions that we would impose in other contexts too, including on crude oil, oil and gas, on
Senator,
revenues.
we reserve the right, if there's a financial institution that's engaging in financing terrorism, to put sanctions back on that institution. That is not a violation of the agreement. It is not a nuclear sanction.
But Iran seems to take a different position.
Well, what Iran does believe is that we can take the nuclear sanctions, put a different label on them, and put them right into place. And what we would have to do is make the case, as we have on many occasions, that institutions should be sanctioned for their behavior on terrorism, and human rights, and regional destabilization. We will continue to do that. We will do it vigilantly, and all of our sanctions that apply in that area still stand.
There's no restraint. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And